When the royal press office unveiled Princess Charlotte as the new leader of the royal foundation, the world gasped, but it was nothing compared to the chaos it unleashed inside the palace walls. The cameras flashed, the announcer's voice cracked with excitement, and the nation froze as the 9-year-old princess stepped forward in a moment that would eclipse even the grandest coronations. Broadcast live on national television, the announcement was both unexpected and electric, sending shockwaves through the monarchy and beyond. For decades, the Royal Foundation had been the crown jewel of royal charitable work, carefully steered by William and Catherine. But here, before millions, it was handed to their daughter a symbolic and deliberate choice that few could comprehend. The public's response was immediate and deafening. Crowds outside Buckingham Palace erupted into cheers. Social media flooded with images of Charlotte smiling shyly as the press heralded her as the new Diana. In homes, pubs, and offices, people spoke in awed tones of the young princess, who seemed destined to bring something new, something healing, to the ancient institution. But even as the cheers echoed across the land, inside the palace corridors the air was thick with disbelief, resentment, and fury. Senior royals exchanged icy glances, whispers rippling like knives through the room. This was no ordinary appointment. It was a declaration of war on the old order. Most visibly shaken was Camilla, whose carefully cultivated composure cracked under the weight of the announcement. Witnesses later recounted how she froze mid-clap, her smile faltering into something that looked almost like panic. She leaned in toward Charles, lips tight, her eyes flashing with disbelief. Some said she muttered something sharp before turning her gaze away entirely. For her, the sight of Charlotte stepping into a role once intended for others was nothing short of betrayal. And yet, at that same moment, William and Catherine stood behind their daughter, tears glistening in their eyes, not of sadness, but of something more complex. Pride, certainly, but also grief. As Charlotte took her place, the resemblance to Diana was impossible to ignore. The tilt of her head, the quiet grace, the resolve. Even William, hardened by years of royal duty, felt the ghost of his mother standing between them, as if Charlotte herself were carrying forward a promise that had never been fulfilled. Headlines around the globe blazed with dramatic declarations: Diana's legacy reborn. Charlotte, the people's princess, rises. A new era for the monarchy. Overnight, the princess became a symbol not just of youth and hope, but of a reckoning decades in the making. But behind the carefully staged smiles, whispers of betrayal and buried secrets began to surface, hinting that this was no ordinary decision, but Charles's last, most dangerous gift to Diana's memory. Few knew that on the night Diana died, Charles made a private vow that would haunt the monarchy for decades. While the world mourned outside, Charles stood alone before her casket, consumed by guilt and regret so heavy it seemed to bend him in two. Those who were there say they heard him murmuring, a strangled confession that no one dared to interrupt. In that silent, suffocating room, he finally spoke to the woman he had failed in life, promising her that her spirit would not be buried with her body. He called it her legacy, and though no one understood at the time, he added another chilling phrase, her daughter. Close aides, standing just beyond the doorway, exchanged uneasy glances. His voice cracked as he repeated those words over and over. Your daughter will finish what you began. The meaning was lost in the grief of the moment, dismissed by many as the ramblings of a man shattered by tragedy. Yet, those words would linger like a ghost in the palace corridors, growing louder each time Charlotte's name was whispered years later. Even then, Charles seemed to know something no one else could see, that the story of Diana would find its next chapter in the eyes of a little girl who didn't yet exist. Years later, buried among Diana's personal effects, a letter surfaced, a letter written by Charles to Diana's sisters shortly after the funeral. Its existence had been carefully concealed, but those who discovered it could never forget its contents. In it, Charles admitted his failures, his regrets, and most importantly, a promise to preserve Diana's spirit through the next generation of royal women. He referred to an unnamed daughter who, he wrote, will carry her fire into the cold halls of this house. The sisters never spoke publicly of the letter, but it is said they never looked at him the same way again. So why did Charles keep this vow a secret for nearly 30 years? Why didn't he declare it when William married Catherine, or when their first child was born? Some believe it was guilt that silenced him, Others say it was fear that to reveal his promise too soon would tear the family apart. Whatever the reason, he carried the burden quietly, watching as the world moved on without Diana, while the wound inside him never truly closed. And then, Charlotte was born. Even as an infant, Charles would stare at her for long stretches, unnerving those around him. He would say, almost to himself, how much she reminded him of Diana. The piercing eyes, the quiet poise even in her crib, the subtle defiance when others tried to fuss over her. Those who witnessed it began to understand that he saw something in her no one else did, something that made his vow impossible to ignore any longer. It was in those quiet moments, between his stolen glances and her small but certain gestures, that the idea of her as Diana's heir became more than a fantasy. It became inevitable. A quiet rebellion was taking root, a rebellion Charles himself had set in motion long ago, and one that would finally rise the night Charlotte was chosen. As the old promise resurfaced, cracks in the monarchy widened, and those who felt betrayed began to fight back. Behind closed doors, Camilla's fury exploded, accusing Charles of humiliating her and risking everything for a ghost. The grandeur of the announcement was barely over when the palace corridors echoed with a confrontation so raw and cutting that even the most hardened aides hesitated to intervene. Camilla cornered Charles in the drawing room, her voice sharp enough to pierce through the thick walls. "You've humiliated me before the world," she spat, her words shaking with rage. "You've let her control you from beyond the grave." For years, she had endured whispers that Diana's shadow still loomed over her marriage. But this was something else entirely. To see Charlotte take the mantle, to see the nation declare her Diana reborn, was a humiliation Camilla could neither forgive nor ignore. Charles, already weary, barely raised his voice in response, but his silence only ignited her further. "She's been dead for decades, and still she wins," Camilla hissed. "You've turned your back on me to appease a ghost. You've crowned that child as her successor and left me to pick up the pieces of my own legacy." Her words cut deeper than she likely intended. Because buried within her anger was fear that Charlotte's new role would erase everything she had fought for, everything she believed she had earned as queen consort. The tension didn't end there. Later that evening, at what was meant to be a quiet family dinner, Camilla could no longer contain herself. With all eyes upon her, she rose from the table, slammed her hand down, and delivered her final accusation. "You've destroyed everything, Charles. You've made me nothing again." The sound of her chair scraping across the floor and the thunderous slam of the door as she stormed out left everyone stunned. In her absence, the silence at the table was deafening. But amid the chaos, one figure remained still: Charlotte. Sitting quietly at the far end of the table, she observed everything with an unsettling calm. There was no fear in her gaze, no tears, no confusion, just an unspoken confidence, as though she had already prepared herself for this battle. Those who watched her that night said she seemed to embody Diana more than ever, her presence quietly challenging those who dared oppose her. In the days that followed, whispers grew of Camilla's determination to strike back. Close allies reported that she retreated into her private quarters and began reaching out to confidants, laying the groundwork for what they described as a countermove. No one knew exactly what she was planning, but everyone agreed. Camilla would not let this slight go unanswered. As Camilla retreated to plan her next strike, another royal stepped forward to expose even deeper truths about Charles's final gift. Even William couldn't hold back anymore. What he admitted that night left the family reeling. When the walls of the palace grew too heavy with silence, he sought out Charlotte, requesting a moment alone with her. The young princess stood before him, calm and unflinching, as though already knowing what was coming. He took a deep breath, his voice trembling with emotions he'd buried for years. In a low, unsteady tone, he confessed his fears that the weight of Diana's memory was not a gift but a burden, and that placing it on her tiny shoulders might crush her entirely. The words spilled from him faster now, as if they'd been waiting just beneath his skin all along. He admitted he felt torn apart, caught between three worlds: loyalty to his father who made the impossible decision, devotion to his wife who stood proudly behind Charlotte, and the unshakable pull of his mother's ghost that had haunted him since childhood. Each demanded something different from him, and in trying to please them all, he feared he was losing himself. His confession deepened, becoming darker, more raw. He revealed that before the public announcement, he had gone to Charles in private, practically begging him not to name Charlotte as leader. He feared what the spotlight could do to her, feared that history might repeat itself and swallow her whole. But Charles, resolute and unmoved, had refused to listen. Then came the most painful revelation of all. William admitted that a small, shameful part of him felt jealousy and ache he couldn't quiet. That he believed, all his life, that he would be the one to carry Diana's torch, to redeem her legacy, and to heal what had been broken. Seeing that torch placed into Charlotte's hands instead left him feeling hollow, as though his mother's love and the public's adoration had been passed over him entirely. He paused here, his words thick with regret, as Charlotte simply watched, her silence more powerful than any response he could have imagined. At that moment, Catherine entered quietly and stood beside them. Unlike William, she showed no sign of doubt, no flicker of hesitation. She placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, but kept her eyes on her daughter. It was clear where her allegiance lay. She believed in Charlotte, in her strength, in her destiny. Her quiet support spoke louder than any argument, and it reminded William what was truly at stake. Overcome, William dropped to one knee before Charlotte. His voice broke as he called her Diana's heir, words heavy with reverence, sorrow, and surrender. Those watching from a distance said the room felt charged in that instant, as though the air itself had shifted, and even the shadows seemed to acknowledge that the torch had truly been passed. But just as the family began to confront their pain, a hidden player emerged with secrets capable of destroying everything Charles had built. Buried in a locked safe for decades was a folder labeled only "For Charlotte," and its contents would stun the monarchy. For years it had been nothing more than a rumor, a whispered secret passed between the few who dared speak Diana's name aloud in the dark corners of the palace. But the moment Charlotte was named as leader of the royal foundation, the key was quietly retrieved, and the safe finally opened. Inside lay Diana's private diaries and letters, pages upon pages of her most intimate thoughts, each one addressed simply, "To my daughter." The discovery alone sent shivers through the household staff. But it was the revelation that Charles himself had ordered these papers sealed and entrusted to a single, loyal aide that deepened the intrigue. The man who stepped forward was a quiet, forgotten figure, long retired and living in obscurity, who confessed he'd been carrying this secret at Charles's command. He revealed that shortly after Diana's death, Charles had summoned him and pressed the folder into his hands with one instruction: "When the time comes and you'll know when this goes to her." He had waited decades for the right moment, and now, trembling, he handed the folder to Charlotte as the palace watched in stunned silence. The contents of those letters were more than personal musings. They were a manifesto, a vision Diana had dared to imagine for the future of the monarchy, one she believed only her daughter, real or symbolic, could fulfill. In her careful handwriting, she described her fears of a crumbling royal family consumed by vanity and tradition, and her hope that one day someone with her blood would rise to mend it. She wrote of the struggles she endured to bring humanity into the gilded cage of royalty, and of her belief that the next true change would come not through her sons, but through "the daughter I feel in my heart." What chilled everyone most was the eerie accuracy of her predictions. In her diary, she even described the moment she would be betrayed, and how her downfall would clear the way for a young girl, one who carries my spirit, to finish the fight she could not. These were not the ramblings of a broken woman. They were the words of someone who foresaw both her end and her successor's rise with haunting clarity. It was these documents that ultimately shattered Charles's resolve to maintain royal tradition. Reading them again years later, he was said to have wept openly, convinced that Diana had spoken directly to him through the decades. Her words, pleading for her legacy to be entrusted to her daughter, had left him no choice but to defy the crown's expectations and name Charlotte. But if these revelations were shocking, they also unleashed a deeper dread among the palace staff. For if such truths had been hidden in one folder, what else lay buried in Diana's archives? What other confessions, accusations, or demands might yet surface? The whispers grew louder, suspicion thickened, and the monarchy braced itself for the inevitable public reckoning, and the stage was set for a final showdown. On a stormy night inside Buckingham Palace, everything came to a head and the monarchy teetered on the edge of collapse. The family had been summoned under the guise of an emergency discussion, But everyone knew what it really was, an ultimatum. Charles sat at the head of the long table, frail yet unyielding, his eyes fixed on the door as one by one they entered. Camilla arrived first, her fury still simmering beneath a brittle smile. William and Catherine followed, hands clasped but tension written all over them. Finally, Charlotte walked in, her presence alone enough to ignite a spark in the air. Charles began with a plea for unity. But before he could finish, Camilla's voice cut through the room like a blade. She rose to her feet, accusing him of orchestrating a spectacle that humiliated her and desecrated the throne. "This ends tonight," she declared, her tone sharp with menace. "Charlotte must step aside, or I will expose every secret this family has tried to bury." Gasps rippled through the room. Her words were deliberate, venomous, and left no doubt that she was ready to scorch the earth if it meant reclaiming her place. For a moment, silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Then William stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward. He could no longer contain himself. His voice thundered as he defended his daughter, defending the memory of his mother in the same breath. "You dare threaten my child in this house? You dare tarnish her for the same crime you once despised Diana for being loved?" His hands shook, but his words cut deep, every syllable dripping with years of restrained rage. But it was Catherine who delivered the final blow. Rising slowly, she spoke with a quiet authority that stilled even Camilla's tirade. "Charlotte is more like Diana than anyone here," she said, her voice steady and unflinching. "You can see it in her courage, in her grace, in the way she carries herself. If that terrifies you, then perhaps it's because you've always known you could never silence Diana's spirit, and you won't silence it now." For the first time, Camilla's defiance faltered. And then Charlotte, silent until now, took a breath and spoke. "I accept this," she said, softly, but firmly, her gaze sweeping over each of them. "I accept what she began. I am not afraid." In that moment, the room fell utterly still, as though even the storm outside had quieted to listen. The weight of her words broke something in Charles. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes welled as he whispered, "My final gift to Diana." It was not just an admission but a surrender, a final acknowledgement of the woman he had wronged, and the child now chosen to right it. But even as the family seemingly united, the world outside was waiting, and they were far from ready for what came next. When the public learned the truth about Charlotte's appointment, the floodgates opened, and the monarchy was never the same. In the hours after that stormy family confrontation, crowds began to gather outside Buckingham Palace, their chants echoing into the night, "Charlotte! Charlotte!" The air was thick with emotional strangers weeping openly, holding candles, clutching photographs of Diana as though she herself had risen. People who had long lost faith in the institution now stood shoulder to shoulder, united not for the crown, but for the little girl they already believed would save it. The media, never known for mercy, was suddenly ablaze with rare, unbridled praise. Headlines blared across every paper and television screen, "Diana lives on through her granddaughter, a princess for the people once more, and the heir of hope." Commentators called it a miracle, a rebirth of what was lost decades ago when Diana's life was cut short. Every word Charlotte spoke, every look she gave, was analyzed and celebrated, her grace under pressure only fueling the sense that something historic had begun. But not everyone came out of the moment unscathed. Camilla found herself dragged mercilessly through the tabloids, portrayed as the scheming villain who dared to stand in the way of Diana's legacy. Paparazzi captured her in unflattering moments, headlines accusing her of trying to sabotage Charlotte, of plotting to protect her own power at the cost of the family's honor. The once carefully managed image of the queen consort began to crack, and though she kept her composure in public, sources claimed her private rage was uncontainable. Meanwhile, something remarkable began to happen across Britain. Young girls, many too young to remember Diana, started writing letters to Charlotte. Thousands of notes flooded the palace, written in childish scrawl but brimming with admiration. They called her brave, they called her inspiring, they called her the princess who would change everything. Teachers reported classrooms filled with drawings of Charlotte, little girls wearing paper crowns with her name etched in glitter. For the first time in years, the monarchy seemed alive again, not through pomp and tradition, but through the hope of the people. And then came Charlotte's first official speech, Standing on the palace balcony, she invoked her grandmother's ideals with a clarity and determination that stunned even her fiercest critics. She promised to modernize the monarchy, to listen to the people, to bring light into the darkest corners of the institution. Every word rang with conviction, as though Diana herself had written the speech from beyond. And as she finished, the crowd erupted into cheers that seemed to shake the palace to its foundations. Even those royals who had kept their distance began to show quiet, telling gestures of support. Princess Anne, long regarded as one of the most pragmatic and reserved members of the family, was spotted placing her hand gently on Charlotte's shoulder after the speech, leaning in to whisper something only the two of them would ever know. Others followed suit, their silence giving way to subtle but powerful signs of allegiance. Yet, as Charlotte stepped into the spotlight, there were still shadows behind her secrets that had yet to be revealed. In a private ceremony no cameras were allowed to film, Charles placed Diana's sapphire brooch on Charlotte's lapel, sealing her destiny once and for all. The room was silent but heavy with meaning as the frail monarch rose from his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the heirloom that had once belonged to the woman who haunted every corner of his reign. His voice cracked as he spoke his final public words to Charlotte, words meant to bind the past to the future. "You are what she dreamed of," he whispered, "and what I could never give her." That simple statement carried the weight of decades of regret and a quiet resignation that this, his final gift, was the only atonement he would ever offer. The brooch, once pinned proudly to Diana's own dress during her most defiant appearances, was now passed to Charlotte with deliberate care. Those present swore that the air seemed to shift as the clasp closed, the sapphire glinting like a silent pact. It wasn't just jewelry anymore. It was a symbol of the promise Charles had carved in grief all those years ago, now made real in the hands of the next generation. And in that moment, Charlotte stood not just as a child of the monarchy, but as its future, her grandmother's torch finally, irrevocably passed. What struck many, however, was the uncanny echo of Diana in Charlotte's demeanor that day. The same quiet grace, the same subtle defiance in her eyes, the same inexplicable aura of vulnerability paired with strength. Even those who once doubted could no longer deny that she carried something deeper than blood. She carried Diana's spirit, alive and undeniable. And with every measured breath, it became harder to distinguish where the girl ended and the legend began. Not everyone was there to witness it. Camilla's absence from the ceremony was as conspicuous as it was telling. Her seat remained empty, a silent protest that spoke volumes. Some said she had refused outright to watch what she considered her own undoing. Others whispered she couldn't bear to see the brooch, once a bitter symbol of rivalry, pinned to the next queen in waiting. Either way, her shadow lingered even in her absence, a stark reminder that while one battle was ending, another still simmered below the surface. Behind Charlotte stood William and Catherine, visibly moved, their hands clasped tightly in quiet solidarity. William's earlier doubts seemed washed away as his gaze softened, his pride finally catching up to the moment. Catherine stood unflinching, her eyes brimming with tears that she refused to let fall. Together, they watched as their daughter accepted her place in a story far larger than any of them, a story that both honored and avenged the woman they all still mourned. And then, just as the ceremony concluded, Charlotte lifted her eyes and looked directly into the camera, a piercing, deliberate stare that seemed to speak to the world itself. In that one gaze, she signaled not just the closing of an old chapter, but the dawn of a new era, one shaped in her own image. But as the cameras flashed and the applause roared, one question lingered in every corner of the palace. What price would Charlotte pay to carry Diana's legacy into the future? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.